Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Hello, everyone. Today, our guest host, Professor Fong, will present her third and the last episode entitled Poetry and the Pleasures of Everyday Life. Let us welcome Professor Fong.
From the Manchu conquest of the Ming and the founding of the Qing dynasty in 1644 until its fall in 1911, major rebellions, wars, and social upheavals punctuated the late imperial period. The 17th century witnessed the traumatic decades of the Ming-Qing transition. The 19th century was wrecked by foreign aggression and internal uprisings. The lives of countless men and women, old and young, were displaced and often destroyed, regardless of class or region. Yet, even under such harrowing and dangerous circumstances, both male and female poets wrote many long and moving poems to chronicle the disorders experienced in their own and other people's lives. In this final episode on Ming and Qing poetry, we will first listen to the long poem by the woman poet and scholar Wang Duanshu, entitled Song of Suffering Calamity, about her personal experience after the fall of the Ming dynasty, before we turn to finish on an uplifting note with a few examples of the many poems written by men and women in peaceful times that record everyday pleasures and their reflections on life. A native of Shaoxing in Zhejiang province, Wang Duanshu was born in 1621, just 23 years before the fall of the Ming dynasty to the Manchus. Her father was a minister of the Ming, a loyalist who starved himself to death after Shaoxing fell to the Qing. Wang Duanshu recorded her own plight of fleeing from the advancing Qing troops with the retreating Ming soldiers in 1645. She vividly recounts her harrowing experience in Song of Suffering Calamity, a heptasyllabic ancient-style poem.
Song of Suffering Calamity. Before the year Jiashan, the common people had plenty. I remember I lived among groves of brocade flowers. Orioles twittered by the curtains as the sun rose high. Slow to get up and dress, I lingered in the scented bed. Once soldiers and horses crossed Xiling, books and histories were scattered, and thousands of gold pieces given up. My hair unkempt and wearing plain clothes, I missed the chance to follow my elder cousin to the country village. The army orders in Wuning were extremely strict. Soldiers were not permitted to stay the night in civilian houses. At this time, my heart was full of a myriad worries. The river wind blew in my face, yet I dared not cry. At midnight the tide rose at lightning speed. Calling my boy, who would not rouse, the situation was pressing. Spending the night on the beach, water lapped our bodies. Sleeves of light gauze soaked through in layers. Hearing the order, we marched with the troops again. Cold dew reached our bodies before the cock crowed. From here on, we followed along without stopping. When the horses neighed, we thought it was the bugle sound. Perspiration poured while tears flowed like blood. Heaven put us in a terrible strait. Rivers and bridges have come to an end. How could I take these circumstances in my sickly state? My shoe heels were ripped from treading. My skin was cracked. In Dingsai, waves roared with huge thunderclaps, clinging to life. At this point, my hopes had turned to ashes. Thinking that my parents were still alive, I burned with worry. Willing to taste the sharp blade, braving death, I made my way back. At every step, my heart beat with fear. The sky was turning to dusk. Our derelict boat, by mistake, went to the Zhong family crossing. Robbed of our travel money, we did not have enough to eat. In sobbing wind and weeping rain, I felt depressed by the road ahead, though secretly glad that we returned alive from the barricade. Blushing with shame, where could I put my humiliated face? The walls covered with creepers, the gate half open. My sister had gone to become a nun. My father was dead. From now on, feelings will be distant between the dearest of kin. For the time being, I will dwell to the east of the pond. Luckily, I still have the odes and history to enhance my humble hut. Out of the way, I don't seek the carriages of the eminent. At dawn, pear blossom rain splashes my secluded window. At dusk, I borrow fragments of stars to mend the broken tiles. Occasionally, I hear the sound of a wild goose descending from the clouds. I feel saddened by its sorrowful cries, so like my own.
The poem opens with a picture in the poet's memory of the peaceful life of luxury before the Manchu conquest, surrounded by feminine images such as brocade flowers, curtains, and scented bed. The female persona is ensconced in the inner quarters, the proper spatial location for women. This dreamlike life of comfort is rudely disrupted by the imminent arrival of invading troops. The remainder of the poem turns to a narration of the poet's arduous flight from the Manchus, her equally harrowing journey home, and the state of devastation she discovers on her return. Along with her young son and other kin and townspeople, Wang Duanshu was thrown onto the open road as a fugitive. She describes their nightmarish march to Dinghai, sleeping in the open and on wet beaches along the way. The image of her shoes with heels ripped from trudging poignantly reminds the reader of the difficulty of the march for women with bound feet. Wang Duanshu probably made her way home sometime in 1646. However, when she arrives back, she learns that her elder sister has left home to become a nun, and her father, the loyalist scholar Wang Siren, has committed suicide. Near the end of the poem, even amid her shattered life, as a learned gentry woman, Wang Duanshu is able to find consolation and hope in the remains of Chinese culture, signified by the Confucian canons, the Book of Poetry, and the Shangshu, classic of history, that have survived the ravages of war and foreign invasion. The experience of loss and dislocation was so complex and traumatic that, for those who had the means and skill, writing must have served as a therapeutic means of regaining some sense of control, order, and personal dignity. The poetic form itself provided the formal regularity of structure, rhyme, and rhythm, into which literate victims of war and violence were able to channel their anguish and seek to manage their trauma. Poetry as a cultural force indeed pervaded the everyday life of literate women and men in the Ming and Qing. This is amply reflected in the large repertory of poems on the pleasures of everyday life we find in poetry collections from this period, which offer an uplifting contrast to the poems recording experiences of violence and disorder examined previously. This podcast concludes, then, with two poems by women at different ends of the life course that afford some insight into this ubiquitous dimension of Chinese poetic discourse. On a summer day, dwelling in the mountains. The hills are quiet, just right for hot weather. Wind through the pines enters into clear dreams. Rain colors fly across precipitous cliffs. On ancient trees sob the sound of cicadas. Stitching embroidery has been my lesson in recent years, watching clouds, sentiments beyond phenomena. If one does not know what the dusty world is far away, in vain one will try to prove no rebirth. Judged from the aesthetics of poetic craft, the pentasyllabic regulated poem On a Summer Day Dwelling in the Mountains by the young Yan Liu is obviously inspired by and modeled after the nature poems of the Tang poet Wang Wei, but one that also embodies gendered experience. Yan Liu is learning to embroider and to write poetry, requisite skills of cultured young women of gentry families in this period. On the formal level, traces of literary practice are apparent. The poem has the required rhymes and tonal antithesis. The prescribed parallelism of the second and third couplets is largely met on the syntactic, but not quite on the semantic and grammatical levels. She borrows freely from the well-known vocabulary and syntax of Wang Wei's famous regulated verses, the sound of wind through the pines, watching clouds, beyond phenomena, and the verb ye, sob or choke, including inverting its syntactic position with the subject, sound of cicadas, in line 4. But the one thing that is new in this poem is the motif of embroidering and its seemingly natural place in a woman's everyday life, which encompasses seamlessly the enjoyment of nature, the art of poetry, women's work, and spiritual contemplation. Similarly, in Recited While Sick, the Manchu woman Meng Yue, a widow for most of her life, fully exploits the attributes of femininity conventionally associated with women's illness and the spatial location of the inner quarters in her self-representation. Recited While Sick. Not aware that my fingers have turned slim, I find the dust heavy. Surprised by the rope's length, I didn't realize that my shoulders had grown thin. With empty mind, I quietly chew over the flavor of the oats and history. In the silent room, I frequently smell the fragrance of ink. Since ancient times, the zither strings have emitted unusual sounds. So many wild phrases when I put the brush to write pure poetry. From the flavor experienced in illness, I attain true inspiration. I savor slowly the hidden leisure beyond things. The effect of the emphasis on the femininity of illness in the opening couplet does not result in the image of a fragile beauty languishing in sorrow. Instead, the persona turns to chew over the meaning of the book of poetry and classic of history, with a mind free from mundane cares in a quiet environment. Her mind intellect is rendered sensually as taste. She chews the classics, is inspired by the flavor of illness, and savors hidden leisure. Her intellectual discernment, rendered through the metaphor of taste, almost fuses with her sense of smell and motion when she writes uninhibited poems with fragrant ink. She claims that these wild lines of poetry are akin to extraordinary music on the ancient instrument, and concludes that it is through illness that she has reached inspiration and spiritual transcendence. The hidden leisure beyond things. This attitude takes her beyond a mundane experience of illness to a spiritual dimension in everyday existence. Such is the transformational power of poetry.
Let us thank Professor Fong for such a stimulating talk. This talk concludes her topic on Ming-Qing poetry. To learn more about this topic from Professor Fong, you may read her chapter on Ming-Qing poetry in How to Read Chinese Poetry, a Guided Anthology. Next Tuesday, we'll hold a grand finale celebrating the completion of this year-long podcast program. I cordially invite you all to join us on Zoom and meet all the guest hosts whose talks you have already heard. To meet all the guest hosts, we also look forward to hearing your suggestions on how to turn our podcast episodes into visual ones. And this is what we plan to do in the future, and your feedback and suggestions will be most helpful. We look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's relax and listen to a reading of the poems in Mandarin.
苦难行，甲申以前民树丰，一夕犹在花锦丛。莺转帘笼日影横，雍庄卷起香帷中。一字西陵渡兵马，书史飘零千金舍。既病蓬松轻诉伤，无竹宗兄走村也。武宁军令甚严肃，步兵不许民加速。此计于心万湖愁，江风阔面焉敢哭。半夜江潮若电入，忽而不醒事偏急。宿在沙滩水极深，轻纱衣袂层层湿。听传军令数队行，冷露薄身机未明。是此长随不知止，马嘶一味画角声。汉下成斑泪成雪，苍天困人凉何节。病至何堪受此情， 斜根踏战肌肤裂，定海波涛轰巨雷，贪生至此念已灰，私心犹在心似焚，故参锋刃冒死回，步步心惊天将木，百州错打江家渡，行姿玉洁实不敷，凄风泣雨悲前路，暗喜生从关上归，抱念修言何所以，强颜蔓草非半开，五子出家老父死，骨肉至此情亦疏，幸得诗书润茅屋，僻静无求贤者车，晓来俚语幽窗洒，目借残星补破瓦，偶听云声送落红，哀其凄恻如相同。夏日山居，山径偏移暑，松风入梦清，微檐飞雨色，古树燕蝉声。刺绣年来客，看云雾外晴，不知尘世远，聊慰正此生。病中咏，不觉指仙闲沉重，哪知兼受亚衣长。心虚但嚼诗书味，市井频闻汉墨香。秦怪出弦音自古，诗清下笔句多狂。病中滋味得真趣，物外悠闲细细尝。